All right, so we will get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Amy Clausen here at the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum, and welcome to our weekly webinar. Today, I'll be monitoring the Q&A and the chat boxes as usual. So if you have any questions for David today or any comments you want to make, feel free to put them in either of those boxes, and I'll field them to him at the end of his presentation. So today, as I mentioned, our presenter is David Hemmings, who's the president of the Niagara Historical Society. And since moving to Niagara-on-the-Lake in 2008, David has written 8 local history books, given numerous talks, and run a small publishing house. He served on the Municipal Heritage Committee and the Town of Niagara-on-the-Lake's UNESCO Committee, and he also conducts public sessions of practical genealogy and family history at the Niagara-on-the-Lake Library. So today, David's going to share with us his presentation called "Was Your Grandmother a British Home Child?" based on his extensive research on this topic. So welcome, David. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amy. And welcome, everybody. The interest in British home children here in Niagara-on-the-Lake is that a Miss Maria Rye in the 1860s decided that emigrating orphan children or those that were just left on urban streets in Britain to come to Canada, started a home here in Niagara-on-the-Lake in a place called Rye Heritage Park, which still exists today, as you can see from the image in front of you. There are today a couple of plaques, which I'll talk about a little later in the talk, right there to commemorate what happened here and explain why the park is called the Rye Heritage Park. Miss Rye was that is Maria Susan Rye, was the eldest of 9 children, middle class, but reasonably well-to-do. 2 of her brothers became attorneys. Her father was an attorney, and 1 brother became an entomologist. All of the girls in the family ended up working with Maria Rye in the emigration of girls to Canada over the career that she had, and particularly Elizabeth Rye, the second child in the family, who had her own set of homes after Maria Rye's day here in Canada. Miss Rye, just to set the stage, Miss Rye is was a contemporary of Florence Nightingale. And of course, so all of the nursing changes, all of the computing understanding that Ada Lovelace brought in, the household management book, highly successful, written by Mrs. Beaton, and other women were starting to have a voice in the mid-1800s. One person in particular I find most interesting to talk about, and that is Dr. James Barry. Yes, looks like a man. He was the Surgeon General of the British Army and the Inspector General of Hospitals in Canada in 1857, but discovered that she was actually a woman, Margaret Ann Bulkley, just after her death during the course of her interment. So it's interesting how women were able to get to very senior positions, sometimes in various and sundry areas through various means. This was also a period in which the Catholic students of the day were warned away from places like Oxford and Cambridge universities because they taught the wrong things. And those are the days when Anglicanism, the Church of England teachings in Britain were very strong, and Miss Rye was an evangelical Anglican. during her lifetime. And this was also in 1867, of course, the time when Canada became a self-governing dominion. And that made a huge difference to it becoming an independent country that needed to be populated by one means or another in order to become its own entity, which it did right after the First World War. There were also, during the 1860s, a lot of laws that started to come in Britain that were significant. Such were the areas of poverty, the areas of charities, and specifically work to improve the position of children. Of course, the 1800s was also the period when there were a significant number of workhouses in Britain. These awful places were the places where husbands and wives were separated, and they were also separated from their children. But we'll talk more about that in a short while. And public health and public assistance started to become in vogue in the first part of the 20th century. And it really wasn't until after the Second World War that the National Assistance Act actually closed all the workhouses and so on and so forth. So we have to think about a time frame before the nanny state, back when these very early regulations were starting to be put in place in Britain. The other side of Britain was, of course, the stink in the urban areas. If you take London, for example, the open sewage through the streets caused numerous diseases such as cholera and typhoid and smallpox, scarlet fever, consumption, and so on, which is TB. And so it was the work of Joseph Bazalgette and the sewage system of 82 miles, which wasn't actually finished until 1875, that served about 2.5 million in London, that the very first attempt to take sewage off the street and actually put it into underground pipes started to take place. And of course, even during that time and up until just before the First World War, there were still horses on the street, horses and carriages, and so you still had defecation going on the streets, and of course that was pretty significant in terms of health problems in urban areas. This is typically, of course, as you can imagine, when houses are built in the 1800s, they did not get demolished right away. It took decades and decades for many of these properties to be demolished, and the sort of properties that these British home children came from are such as you see in front of you. You notice that in the middle of at least 3 of the streets in 3 photographs there, the 2 in the middle and the 1 on the left, bottom left, there is an open sewage tract that goes down the street, and if you lived on the bottom floor, you had to make really sure that the people upstairs who were throwing their sewage out didn't throw it on top of you. And of course, you had to hope that there weren't too many blockages, and that the sewage flowed out into a more main street. Needless to say, the children were playing in all of this area and muck. And it was pretty awful for these kids, as you can see on the right side, the sorts of conditions under which many of these children were living when they were picked up by Maria Rye's organization in the early period of her work in the 1860s and 1870s. The workhouses themselves were almost equally strenuous to be in. All the women, top left, were all together doing various cooking and sewing and other such things. The men did mindless jobs. The one on the top right did mindless jobs such as chopping wood and so on and so forth. And the one in the middle at the top and the one on the left at the bottom is children in their rags and difficult circumstances altogether, no parents around. And it was only occasionally when they picked out some bright children who had the opportunity of going to a school such as the one in the bottom right, that things started to improve a little bit for some children. This is a typical workhouse of about 300 paupers. The women and the dormitories for women were on one quadrant, the men on another quadrant. The boys and girls had their own quadrant separately. And they lived and ate and worked every day in each of those quadrants. So when Maria Rye came along, her initial work was to publish a lot of the problems that children were having in the urban areas of Britain. And she had a publishing house that put out these pamphlets and became fairly well known for the work that she was doing. She then decided that she would start to move some of the younger people, primarily those in their late teens and early 20s, who were already of an age to become capable domestics, to places like Australia and New Zealand. The only problem with that, and she went there to do that work, was that it was a long way. I mean, if it takes you 6 months to get there on a sailing ship, you know, it's a long time there and back to do anything. Fortunately, with Canada being much closer, the opportunities started to build as for Canada as being the preferred destination for many of these children that were to be emigrated. And her efforts were encouraged and approved of by people of distinction, such as the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Earl of Shaftesbury, both the British and Canadian governments, and the Workhouse Guardian. So whether you like this as a concept or not, the governments were buying into it. In 1867, then, it became clear that women of the age of, say, 5 to girls, I should say, 5 to 17, were probably going to end up being the primary target for immigrants going to Canada, that being by far the closest large colony to go to. And so Miss Rye cut a deal with the Allen line of ships, which shipped out of Liverpool, typically 100 plus minus girls per voyage in steerage, starting in 1868, 1869, thereabouts. And typically on sailing ships, the early voyages took a couple of weeks. If the weather was bad, it could be 3 or 4 weeks. And if it was wintertime, of course, they could only get into Halifax. They couldn't get into Quebec City because the St. Lawrence was frozen over. Those were the days when you could walk across the St. Lawrence during wintertime. So the uptake in Canada became hugely enthusiastic. The farm owners, and as well as independent homeowners, wanted people that they didn't have to pay much to do various forms of work for their board and lodging. And so girls were adopted, fostered, hired, depending on their age. And very often these girls were taken up almost within days of their arrival. So they were placed literally almost, not quite off the ship, but close to. And by the way, to get to Niagara-on-the-Lake, of course, they came by ship to Quebec City or to Halifax. Then they took a train, the CPR train, to Toronto, and then they took a horse and wagon to Niagara-on-the-Lake. As a result of this, the initial tests that Maria Rye did with a few hundred kids, it became clear that she could buy our Western home, which was in Rye Park in Niagara-on-the-Lake, formerly the old jail and courthouse, for $1,000. And so she bought that with some of the funds that she had acquired, and also a home in Peckham in London Borough, South London, in England, which was the other end, if you like, of the chain for bringing children from Britain to Canada. Not all kids actually came to Niagara-on-the-Lake, although they were all administered through here. Some, because the homes were actually in Toronto or Montreal, or some of the places along the way, they would be dropped off on the way. So the flow of what were referred to in those days as gutter children from British urban streets and workhouses had begun, and it was a huge enterprise that became very successful. Miss Rye was the very first person, and her organization was the first to do this work. It was shortly followed by Annie McPherson north of the lake. So that work continued to grow, not just through Miss Rye's organization, but through other organizations that started to come up having seen what Miss Rye and Miss McPherson were doing. The initial ships that they used were the Hibernian and Sarmatian. Those were sailing ships, as you can see, with later with a steamship capability. They would, as I said, take a couple of weeks to get across the Atlantic, and the weather was whatever the weather was. And so you had to rely on goodwill and hope that everything would go well between Britain and here. Our Western home looked roughly like this. It had a courtyard, a patio sort of arrangement there with a sort of a roofing on it around the building, sort of like an apron that was added to the courthouse and jail building that was originally there. It was run on a day-to-day basis by Emily Bailey, and Miss Rye came when she could to help out. On the west side, you get the same sort of a picture, but you can see a little bit more of the garden that was there. There was also an orchard. There were large vegetable patches. There were chickens and other animals there being tended by the people who were in the home, and many of the girls that came through. In terms of training, the training was mostly done back in Britain before they came to Canada. Some was done here, but not very much, because typically placements occurred quite quickly after they arrived here. So these were not homes in the sense of schools in which there was a continuum over years of internment. This is very much a holding place with a bed for a month or two or possibly 3, after which the girls would be placed in some home somewhere in, say, southern Ontario. Here is one of the very earliest groups of girls that came to our Western home here in Niagara-on-the-Lake. At this point in time, we don't actually have the exact date of this photograph, although we have been collecting some photographs of individuals, and at some point we may be able to identify when this photograph was actually taken. We do know who the adults are in the photograph, however. Just a few more photographs from the excellent museum collection that we have. And I have to, at this point, thank the Taylors for the collection that they produced for the museum 20 years ago. It is an excellent collection of paper material, and a lot of that material was used in order to create some of the work that has more recently been done. Because this was very much an Anglican, from a religious perspective, very much an Anglican-run area, the children used to go to St. Mark's Church on Sundays for service every Sunday. You can see here them lining up, waiting to be walked down King Street to St. Mark's in the morning. The lady on the right-hand side in this photograph is Mrs. Hannah Safi, who was the lady who used to be the traveling matron across the Atlantic for many, many of these kids. She did about 30 crossings both ways, 30 crossings of the Atlantic during the course of her time in support of Maria Rye and her organization. And we know, we have documentation, documentary evidence of the work that she did. This gives you an example of the companies or the entities that did work similar to Maria Rye in terms of emigration of British home children. There are some very well-known names here, like Dr. Bernardo's, and you can see that there were 2 or 3 entities there that certainly got over 10,000 British home children brought over here to Canada. And then there were others as well that were in the sort of other group there that you can see, and the years roughly when they started. So you can see that Maria Rye started in 68, and Annie McPherson started in 1870, and then the others like Middlemore and others started in about 1873. And at the bottom right, the photograph of Avenue House in Peckham, South London, that's where the operation on the British side was headquartered for Maria Rye. It happens to be about within walking distance of my grandmother's shop in Peckham. On September the 28th, 2008, September the 28th being British Home Children Day every year here in Canada, we installed, thanks to Liz Surtees and David Murray and the town of Niagara-on-the-Lake, as well as the museum staff, 2 plaques that talk about the British home children and our Western home. And now that they're on each side of Rye Heritage Park, anybody going through that area will now understand what why Heritage Park has that name. I'm not going to read through the two inscriptions on each of these two plaques, but it does give you the details of the information that would be helpful, and I hope encourage you to take a look at those plaques sometime at your convenience. The plaques themselves are located just north, just above the center point of this map, right there on the traffic circle at the end of a cul-de-sac. And our western home was closer to the middle of the park there. There are two streets also that are of interest. One is Rye Street. Rye Street was named after Maria Rye right after she retired in 1896. And Cottage Street is because there is a cottage today still being used at the corner of King Street and Cottage. It was the place in which those British Home children that did not do well in their placements and had to come back for a while before they were replaced into some other location, came there because they didn't want to mix them with the new kids coming in from the various voyages. On the museum website today, there is a single spreadsheet of about 5,300 Rye British Home children from 1869 until 1914. The latter part from 1897 to 1914, our Western home was run by the Church of England Waifs and Strays Society, which Maria Rye passed her organization to after she had retired. But it gives you an idea of the surname, the first name, the month that they arrived here in Canada, the age that was stated for them, some information on their status in Britain, where they were placed in Canada, their status in the placement, the name of the ship, and the to and from and to, I should say, ports for that particular voyage. So not everything has been done quite to the extent of this particular part of the chart. We are doing our best to improve it as we go along. And I think in the next year or so, we'll see some fairly substantial improvements, which may be helpful. To get to that particular spreadsheet, simply go to the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum website. You can see the website address there. Go to Collection and Research, go to Links, then under our Western Home is the database of the children and some information about how the research was undertaken. In the museum itself, there is typically a good description of some of the things that happened or are associated with Maria Rye's work, such as a trunk and other things that various British Home children used in their time here in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Unfortunately, this particular lady, girl, I should say, Carolyn Newbold, died of disease shortly after she arrived and is buried in St. Mark's with a number of other kids that also did not survive various diseases in their early days here in Canada. Carolyn's sister, Selena, actually went back to Britain and got married there and has kids and therefore descendants and so on and so forth. And we have that information as well. There is also a British Home Children magazine, which is good, and it shows details of references and actually has a hyperlink to our spreadsheet in its material, and so that's particularly helpful for those that read that magazine. And the Library and Archives Canada also has a hyperlink to our site here in the museum, which allows their readers to see this information as well. And we've had a lot of correspondence as a result of these hyperlinks being put in place. So Maria Rye then, her achievements were that she migrated about 4,700 girls, mostly girls, but I would say perhaps 90% were girls and about 10% boys, from the British urban streets and workhouses to adoptions and farms and good houses in Eastern Canada. Some of those, by the way, were in the Maritimes as well. So some voyages went to Halifax, not to Quebec City. And there are numerous British Home children who ended up in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, etc. She was definitely the first person to do this work from Britain to Canada. I would say that if you looked at some of her faults, you could say that she was probably, there were probably inadequate tests of guardian suitability and limited inspections of the children's welfare at their placements. And to some extent, she relied more on the demand for low-wage servants than the acceptance of yet another family member. Unfortunately, as I will say a little later, we look at this today from a nanny state perspective. We don't look at this from the perspective of people 150 years ago. She was very much an evangelical Anglican, and her leadership, writing, and organization, although very outstanding, also was oriented towards her intent to be charitable to as many of these underprivileged girls as possible. I think the turning points for her were that in the 1840s and 1850s, there were just so many changes going on in Britain in terms of the laws and the voice that women was increasingly getting in the public sphere and so on, that gave her the impetus to make this happen. And she got the people's backing, which I think was hugely important. What motivated her really was to get these gutter children off the filthy streets of Britain and into the open farmlands of North America, in this case, Canada for the most part. As I may have said at the very beginning, some of the girls actually ended up in places like Buffalo. There were 9 girls in 1869 that ended up in Mississippi, in one particular town, where somebody had said that they will make sure that they would have good homes, which apparently they did. And that is to some extent detailed. And that it was her intention that there would be a greater opportunity for these girls to have a good Christian married life. And that work is a part of a project I'm going to talk about before the end of this talk, which you can see in just a moment. So I would say that if there's anything that could have been done better, was more annual inspections of the immigrant children. And it wasn't just her responsibility, it was also the responsibility of the government, and then they did some, but they didn't do a whole lot, I'd have to say. They realized that they did have a responsibility, but I have to say they were probably not as diligent as they could have been. That is the government immigration organization, and so on. So we've talked about, to some extent, I would say that under the umbrella of the Church of England, there were numerous rectors, vicars, so on and so forth in various parishes that took on British Home children. I know that William McMurray, for example, at St. Mark's Church had at least 2 well-documented, I think a third that I think I'm aware of, and that was not uncommon. Also, you might be interested or amused to know that William Kirby's The Golden Dog book, which is his most famous book, is actually dedicated to Maria Rye, and they were very good friends. And Reverend McMurray also conducted Maria Rye, one of Maria Rye's brothers' marriage here in Niagara-on-the-Lake. So that's, and I think the other thing that is sometimes said about Maria Rye was she was just making money. That's really not true. When she died, her will was that she left to the rest of the family to use for more immigration work, was £3,500, which is not a whole lot of money, even those days. So I would say that since all the laws that we tend to look at about the treatment of children derive from a period after World War II, what I refer to as the nanny state, it is very difficult for us, you know, to get out of that mode of thinking and back into the period that she was working in the Victorian underworld. So in conclusion then, on this part, I would say that, you know, through 1896, she emigrated about 4,700 children that we have found so far. There may be more. We know that some of the ships that came into Halifax were not properly documented. And so there were a number of maybe 100 or 2 children who came into the Maritimes that are not well known at this point in time. And the building that should have remained in Rye Park under today's heritage rules was demolished in 1923 after the Polish officers had used it during the First World War. However, Elizabeth Rye did have a home in the Toronto area that she continued to receive girls in, and that closed in 1934. The latest project we're working on now, having got this spreadsheet in place and continuing to improve it, is one in which we're actually looking at the marriages of, that is, those British Home children, girls that actually got married and had kids, and had a modicum of normality in their adult life. And also, of course, got a lot of descendants as well, who we can now communicate with. So starting last year, we've been collecting information on married British Home children, and this would include a family tree. It would include a photograph, their occupational history, and their movements. And so far, we've traced about 130 or so of these marriages, and we're trying to aim at about 550, which would be about a 10% sample, so that we could then start to put in some reasonable statistical and other analysis of the Rye BHCs and sort of start to understand whether the intentions of Maria Rye to have many of her children married and have a decent Christian life did in fact take place. Here are some examples of photographs that I've been able to collect in the course of this project so far. We're getting about, I would say, 15–20% of the population for which we have photographs. Not many, but at least it's a good start. You'll also notice one or two. If you live here in Niagara-on-the-Lake area, there are some reasonably well-known names on this particular slide. The Woodruffs, for example, bottom right, are represented. The Vanderlips are represented, top center. The Reeds are represented, and there are others. Doris Shepherd is well known in the museum. There were three oral texts that she put together on what it was like to be a British home child. And she was also, for a number of years, the cook the principal cook at our Western home. And she lived in Queenston, and she ultimately became a nurse as well. So she was pretty well known in our area and lived a long time and was in an old age home. And we were able to get a lot of really good information from her, which is in the collection in the museum. So in summary then, what we're starting to see is that some girls really made it. And unfortunately, some girls, through disease or through their negligent, their poor upbringing, negligence by their parents, I should say, not by them. They did not survive. They were too weak to survive any great length of time, and so they died fairly soon. But we're beginning to find that a lot of girls who did in fact get married. It's quite a difficult project because some of them were adopted, so their names changed. And in fact, very often when the girls went to a family and enjoyed their time there for, say, 4, 8 years, very often they took on the name of the family. And so you've got to make provision for that when you're trying to find those people in various records. So finally, when the library reopens again, there'll be an opportunity to ask me questions face-to-face. On various family history activities. But more importantly, I think the museum has on its website a huge social history data file set, which are very interesting. It's very interesting to look at sometime at your convenience. And if you want information yesterday instead of tomorrow, then my email address and telephone number is written down here as well. So I hope you've enjoyed the talk, and if there are any questions, I'd be glad to help you.
Thank you very much, David. One thing I noticed when people come to the museum and they're looking for information on ancestors who are British home children was that there was this time period where it was a bit of a taboo thing to be a British home child. I wondered if you found that in your research and if it had, hindered sometimes research because people didn't want to admit that they were, home children.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, anytime you were adopted, you were illegal, or you were from an out of wedlock relationship. Anytime that you were a British home child, any of those particular circumstances were considered taboo. They were considered an embarrassment. And so it was not uncommon for a girl to accept, even in the case of being a domestic in a family household, some sort of name change in order to get away from the name that's associated with the event that we were talking about. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's a concern, and it's a concern only in that when you're trying to find their records, that you have to have a degree of flexibility to go off and look for other names as well that might, in particular places, that might be helpful to you.
Mm-hmm. Shauna says here that we do have a date on that photograph being from 1869.
Right.
So that first one that you showed.
That's excellent. If that can be confirmed, that cuts the number of people that it could be in that photograph. And all I need to do now is find a couple of faces that I could recognize and just make some sort of proper confirmation of that. The adults, unfortunately, you can't be specific on their ages, so you don't really know from the adult pictures exactly which year it is. But if you can find the British Home child, a British Home child in there that you actually know the name of, any one of them, or maybe two, just for confirmation, that would be really helpful, because there were at least 3 voyages in 1869, and so we're talking about several hundred girls coming in that year, and so it'd be nice to know what time of year it was, for example, which voyage it was, who they were. If it was the very first one, that would make it very easy, but we're not sure of that.
I'm not seeing any other questions, but Amanda Emery says fantastic information and resources, so thank you very much, David. And if you, again, David left his email, or you can also filter questions through the museum if you have specific questions, or if you need help kind of navigating the database or anything like that, looking for your own ancestors. David is always happy to help with that as well. So,
and the information about getting a hold of me is in that second document on the website, and so and information about what I'm prepared to do to help is also there as well. So that if you read that second document as well, it will give you a little bit more information that might be useful.
Perfect. So thank you so much, David. Next week on July 30th, we have our curator, Sarah Kaufman, back, this time with an Ask the Curator session. And so if you have any burning questions about Niagara-on-the-Lake's history, or even about what it is to be a curator, or what it's like working here at the museum, submit those questions to us, and Sarah will answer them live next week. So hope you guys all enjoy the day, and we'll see you next week on Zoom. Thanks.
Good. Thank you.